So another topic that we'll address briefly here is speciation. First of all, let's think about the biological species concept. A species consists of genetically similar organisms that interbreed and produce offspring that are fertile. They can have babies themselves. For example, horses and donkeys are very closely related, but they're not in the same species, even though they can reproduce and have a baby, a mule. Horses and donkeys are in separate species because that baby, the mule, is sterile. So even though they're closely related, they're not in the same species. So for speciation to occur, for speciation, the formation of new species to occur, first of all, you start out with two populations of the same species, and in some way or another, those two populations are isolated from each other. They're reproductively isolated. That means there's no flow of genes between them. Over time, random mutations happen in both groups. Since they're random, it's probably different mutations that happen in those two groups. Some of those mutations are good and selected for. Some are bad and selected against. But over time, those mutations cause allele frequency changes to happen. And given enough time, this process can cause those separated populations to diverge into different species. So we're going to talk about two or three main kinds of speciation. The first one is allopatric. This is when you have two populations that are separated by some kind of geographical barrier, maybe an ocean or a mountain or a huge ravine. Because they're geographically separated, they can no longer reproduce. Random mutations happen. Different mutations in the two populations. Some are selected for, some are against. And over time, more and more mutations, more and more differences accumulate. Eventually, so many mutations and so many events happen that the two species are no longer, the two populations at least, are no longer the same species. They're two different species. Now, there's also sympatric speciation. This is when two populations live in the same geographic area, but are still reproductively isolated. This happens more commonly in plants. And it often happens when a plant, something goes wrong in meiosis or in reproduction, and a plant becomes polyploid. It gets an extra set of chromosomes. So it can no longer reproduce with maybe the diploid plants that it descended from. And because they can't reproduce together anymore, those two populations, again, just like in allopatric speciation, build up random accumulations of mutations, and over time, the two populations become more and more different, so different that they're not the same species anymore. The last type of speciation we'll mention is called parapatric. So this occurs when populations are separated not by a geographical barrier, but by some kind of extreme change in habitat. So they might be living side by side, and they ought to be able to interbreed, but usually they don't. Good example of this are plants that live around mines with really contaminated, toxic soil. The plants that live in that soil, a lot of them died, but the plants that survived were the ones that were more tolerant to the metals, the heavy toxic metals in the soil. Well, living just adjacent to that polluted area are probably plants of the same species, but since that ground isn't polluted, the same kind of selection didn't happen there. So you would think that those two plants would interbreed, but oftentimes they don't. And something that causes them not to interbreed are mutations. In some cases, a mutation might happen that causes the flowering time of the plants in the polluted soil to change, the type of temporal separation, so that they no longer can interbreed. Their genes can no longer flow with the plants that are living just maybe a few feet away in the non-polluted soil. Again, this causes random mutations to accumulate, differences accumulate across time, until eventually those two groups, those two populations, are no longer the same species. We'll also talk briefly about adaptive radiation. So this is a process in which organisms diversify very rapidly from some ancestral species into a multitude of new forms and probably new species. And this really happens a lot when there's a change in the environment. Oftentimes it happens after some kind of extinction event, maybe, where a lot of new open niches are available. So it starts with a recent single ancestor with lots of speciation, and it can occur due to a combination of allopatric, parapatric, and sympatric speciation events. Darwin's finches are often used as examples of adaptive radiation. So the founder species might have looked something like this. But due to limited resources, due to different kinds of speciation events, that founding species very quickly speciated into all these different species with different kinds of beaks that could access many different kinds of food. And here we can see maybe it even closer, how that the original ancestral seed-eating ground finch very quickly speciated out into all these different forms of finch with all these different forms of beaks that could access many, many different kinds of foods and therefore avoid competition with the other kinds of finches. Again, that's called adaptive radiation.